early 1950s. And with a number of so-called legal counseling services having been established and operating in various parts of China. But towards the end of the 1950s, because of the kind of prevailing political kind of philosophy at the time, a lot of these offices were shut down, and essentially the legal profession in China ceased to exist for almost 20 years. And in 1979, when China began to have relook at herself and begin to open up to the foreign world again, the legal profession in China was given a new start. And again, we see some so-called legal counseling services being up and running again. And in 1982, some of them changed their name to law offices. And in 1986, the Ministry of Justice, which is the regulator in China regulating the legal profession, began to administer unified national qualifying examinations for lawyers. And in 1989, and that was probably a watershed as far as the legal profession in modern China is concerned, the first batch of non-state-owned law offices were chartered by or were approved by the MOJ. And previously, before then, all the law firms that, for example, I used to deal with when I started off as a trainee were all state-owned entities. They typically operated under the auspices of certain state-owned entities like the CCPIT and so on. But in 1989, lawyers were allowed to set up their own non-state-owned law offices. And in the early 1990s, partnerships began to emerge in China. And in the same year, in 1992, the first batch of foreign firms were licensed to open up branch offices in China. Before then, a number of foreign firms had been operating out of a hotel room and under some, under the disguise of certain consulting companies. But in 1992, a handful of about 5 or 6 law firms were allowed to officially open up in China as a branch office, and we happen to be one of them. And in 1996, the lawyer's law was promulgated in China. Again, that provided a formal legislative framework for example, the qualifications, the rights and obligations, and the duties of lawyers. And at the turn of the century, after China has entered into the WTO, China further opened up the legal services market by allowing foreign law firms to open up a second office in China. Previously, when we first got our license in Beijing, we were only allowed to have one office in China, the so-called one-office policy. And it was very restrictive, but in 2002, they relaxed that regime a little bit by allowing us to open up a second office. And once again, we were one of the first firms to have got that license to do that in 2002. And from then on, in the last 10 years, you all have actually witnessed a phenomenal change in the legal services market in China and in China generally. I think you see, for example, the real estate market really booming. Rick will be able to speak to that. And you see a lot of Chinese companies doing lots of different things that we haven't actually witnessed before the turn of the century, for example. And again, we will hear more of that in this afternoon, particularly on the capital market side. And by the end of 2011, that was at the end of last year, according to official records, there were about 200,000 licensed lawyers working in over approximately 17,000 law firms in China. This may look big, but if you actually consider, the population of China, the number of lawyers per capita is still extremely low compared to some of the more sophisticated Western legal systems. And at the same time, there were about slightly over 200 law firms registered and licensed to practice in China, and they are from about 20 countries. So you can actually see that China is a kind of, if you like, a semi-open kind of system. When I say semi-open, first of all, I'd like to explain this. The international firms are, although we are licensed to set up offices in China, we're not allowed to practice PRC law. And we're not allowed to, for example, hire Chinese lawyers to practice PRC laws. We do have Chinese qualified lawyers working in our offices, but they have to give up their practicing certificates when they join us. And that applies to all international law firms. And as I mentioned earlier, before 1992, there were many so-called China lawyers operating from Hong Kong, and typically they organize themselves as an independent department, as an independent practice group. I think Baker McKenzie, for example, at that time they had a big China group, for example, and some law firms also had set up consultancy companies in China, operating, as I said, out of a hotel room or sort. But that has now completely changed after 20, 25 years of development. And then I have used a slightly provocative title, The Extinction and Rebirth of the Dinosaurs. That's not meant to be any sort of disrespect to those practicing Chinese laws or working in China. But the idea of that title is actually to underline how the market has evolved and how the market has changed over the last 25 years. And one way to actually look at how that change has developed is to look at the types of work that the so-called China lawyers have been working over the years. In the mid-1980s, when I first started out as a trainee, the work that China lawyers used to do was primarily inbound investment work, the so-called foreign direct investment work, or FDI work, as we call it in trade, and some arbitration work as well, acting principally for foreign clients investing in China. In those days, there wasn't a lot of outbound investment by Chinese companies. From mid-1990s, we began to see a steady flow of outbound work coming out from China, typically IPOs. And that was the time when the first batch of the so-called share companies came out to Hong Kong and did their first listing. Beer was the first to have listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And from the turn of the century, again after the entry into the WTO, we have witnessed an increasing volume of different types of work, and also inbound, or different variety of inbound work being added to the mix. So for example, we see more private equity players coming into China, and we see more real estate work being executed in China or in Hong Kong. And that's the last 10, 12 years was the period in which we see substantial, almost exponential growth in the real estate market in China. And there were also a lot of inbound M&A transactions. After an initial period of attracting foreign capital, I think we have reached that stage where certain industries went through certain phases of consolidation, and we saw more M&A transactions happening. And then towards the end of the 2000s, again, that's an interesting period, we have witnessed an increasing volume of different types of outbound work. Again, this period was defined, probably the watershed was in around sort of 2007, when China Development Bank first invested in Barclays Bank. They acquired a stake in Barclays Bank, and have, of course, and they did it before the global financial crisis, lost a lot of money on that deal. But it did actually significantly signified the beginning of this wave of outbound M&A transactions undertaken by Chinese companies. And a lot of people just focus on the outbound M&As, but it wasn't just outbound M&A. You're talking about outbound banking and finance work, which I do, projects, litigation, regulatory, antitrust, debt capital market. You see all these dim sum bonds, for example. A lot of these dim sum bonds were issued by Chinese companies, some by foreign companies as well. So, it has been a fascinating period, I have to say, just over the last 10, 12 years, to see the dramatic change in the landscape in the legal services market in China. And for us, working in international law firms, this also represented probably the biggest period of growth if we actually look back at the last 30 years. And in terms of how the China lawyers have evolved, how the dinosaurs have evolved, so to speak. These days, you actually see very few firms have standalone China departments, and a number of the so-called, almost all of the so-called China lawyers have been integrated into traditional practice groups like banking, corporate, litigation, and so on. And then some of them, by necessity, changes that happen in the market have retooled themselves to focus on whichever areas they choose to specialize in. When we look at the China market, and the Chinese government always likes to say, we are, for example, a socialist market economy with China characteristics. And this expression is actually very commonly used in China. So again, I like to look at the legal services market and try to highlight so-called China characteristics, and from three different perspectives: the good, the bad, and the ugly. First, looking at the good, slightly on a more positive note. As I mentioned earlier, China is a semi-open legal services market, which actually puts China in, I think, in the overall scheme of things, right in the middle of the spectrum. We see a lot of markets being completely open. Hong Kong is probably one of them. Foreign law firms can come in, set up their own offices, do mergers with local firms with very little restrictions. I wouldn't say with no restrictions, but with very little restrictions by and large. At the end of the other spectrum, you have markets like India, which is completely closed, and a lot of people obviously like to compare China with India these days. And India is a very, very closed market. We're not allowed to set up any sort of presence in India, not even a hotel room presence. Some firms try to do that and try to be smart and get sued by the local bar, and they were kicked out of China. And even these days, when we actually go to India on business trips, we have a central register to report the man hours we spend in India. And that's more for tax reasons. But there are a lot of other things which actually restrict our activities in India. So it is a very closed market. So China probably sits somewhere in between. It is semi-open in the sense that they allow international law firms to set up offices in China, but only to practice the laws of their home jurisdiction. For example, technically, although we try to brand ourselves as international firms these days, under our license, we're only allowed to practice English law. Although we practice, of course, we do a bit more than that. And a lot of international law firms have been operating. Although technically, that we are not allowed to practice PRC law. I would say all international law firms have been operating in this so-called, I would call grey market, in the sense that whilst we are not technically allowed to practice PRC laws, we are allowed to advise our clients on the implications of PRC laws on doing business in China. You can readily see that the distinction between the two could be rather blurred. So all international firms therefore have been operating in this grey market, and effectively in these four walls, we are practicing PRC laws. We have a deep knowledge of the PRC laws and regulations. We regularly advise clients on the implications of PRC laws on doing business in China. But what we can't do is to issue a formal legal opinion on Chinese law issues. So we would always qualify, our advice to clients with this big legend saying that, we're not licensed to practice PRC laws. If you need a formal legal opinion, we'll get one for you from a local firm. But most international clients have learned to accept that, and frankly, wouldn't be bothered with getting a formal legal opinion, except in certain types of transactions like banking. The other good thing about the Chinese market is, of course, China is now the second largest economy in the world. It is big, it's huge. And some of the PRC companies are among the biggest in the world. ICBC, for example, is the largest bank in the world by market capitalization. And some of the oil majors in China are amongst the biggest in the world. And the sort of transactions that we handle these days involve billions of dollars. You're looking at huge transaction amounts. Frankly, we haven't seen in Hong Kong or China in my first 20 years or 13 years of practice. But now, handling a $1 billion deal is daily occurrence. And then China, in many ways, is still a developing country, as we've heard from our Chinese leaders. And so there's good, there's the bad, depending on how you look at it. But the good side of that is there is still plenty of room to develop, right? And so again, that's the good aspects of the Chinese market. What about the bad? I've already mentioned that the foreign firms are subject to a number of restrictions. We're not allowed to hire Chinese lawyers to practice Chinese laws. Because of the number of foreign and domestic firms present in China, and competition is extremely keen. And those of us who have been involved in the China market will be able to vouch for that. And the Chinese clients are, in relative terms, still rather unsophisticated in the way they select and use professional service providers, lawyers included. And a lot of state-owned companies, in the name of anti-corruption, they have mandatory procurement processes in place. So, we have to bid for a certain job almost, every week. All major state-owned companies have an established procurement system in place. So, they would typically invite, 3 to 5 law firms to bid for a job. The problem with that is, I don't have a problem with that. We're quite used to this, even with our Western clients. And but the problem with that is, the procurement team who actually interviews us, they're more used to, frankly, buying stationery and computers and things like that. They're not really used to selecting professional service providers. So as long as you have a kind of international sounding name, they think you're all right. And so, frankly, a lot of the cases, the decision was very much down to pricing. And the other thing about China is that you may think that the labor cost is actually quite low. Yes, at the lower end of the spectrum, that is true. So, it doesn't actually cost you a lot to hire a driver, 3 or 40 ladies. But the actual cost of doing business is actually quite high. And there are a lot of hidden costs involved in doing business in China. The taxes and, frankly, the traveling time in Beijing. For those of you who have been in Beijing, you'll be able to attest to that, that you waste a lot of time shuttling, between meetings, for example. So that's, our opportunity cost. So, our lawyers typically cannot operate as efficiently as our counterparts in Hong Kong. Then the ugly. Getting paid in China by the state-owned companies in particular has always been an issue for, I would say, all international law firms. It's not because they don't have the money to these companies are amongst the richest companies in the world. The problem is the internal lengthy payment process. Typically for a bill of 5,000 US, then you need 6 to 7, 8 signatures to sign off on it. So it takes an extraordinarily long period of time to get any simple, small invoice to be processed. So that has been a big problem. But we all live, under this in this current environment. I don't think, realistically, I can actually change that in the short term. Then, on top of that, there is the occasional kind of sort of corruptive practice. Again, not by international firms or even I'm not suggesting local firms do that. But sometimes, you do actually come across individuals in Chinese institutions, frankly, either sort of expressly or impliedly wanting you to give them some kickbacks. We of course never do that. Our reputation, is frankly, so important that we would never engage in that kind of conduct. But you do actually come across individuals like that, and of course, we also we are subject to the FCPA, the Bribery Act in the UK as well, because we are an international law firm. So all these anti-corruption legislation in the US and in the UK also apply to our behavior and conduct in China. And then when you're dealing with private companies, for example, the KYC, know your client, is sometimes an issue. We, as an international law firm, are frankly, often used as as a tool to perpetrate fraudulent behaviors. And we get, scam emails from Nigeria, from India, from China, on a regular basis. People always try to, entice us to send them, a letterhead, and try to use our letterhead, to engage in some fraudulent activities. And so we are extremely careful in taking on work from clients. We don't just accept any work that comes through the door. We vet our clients very rigorously, and with most clients, of course, they're big institutions. We don't have problems satisfying ourselves that they are the sort of clients that we want to act for. But for certain private individuals, for certain private companies in China, where you don't actually see, where you don't have a high degree of transparency, then that could be an issue. And in terms of, for example, simple things like how we going to satisfy that, not going to be used as a tool to engage in money laundering activities. So we're extremely careful. We have a whole set of policies and procedures in place internally to make sure that they're taking on the right sort of clients. But with some of the private companies, doing the necessary checks in China sometimes could be an issue. So whilst you're pondering over your career, I again slightly use this slightly provocative title, because there is a lot of misconception by people who are looking at the Chinese market. They always believe that one-C relationship is king. And I remember when I first tried to persuade some of my junior partners to relocate to China, they were literally in tears in front of me. They literally burst into tears. And said, "Oh, Joe, I'm not a singer. I can't do karaoke. I can't play golf. I don't smoke. I don't drink. And so how am I going to survive in China?" And to which I said, "You don't need to do any of that. Now, that's just a sheer misconception. One-C always helps. It always does. Everywhere in the world, relationship always helps. But it is not fatal if you don't have it now. And you can actually build up relationships over time. But what is important if you want to work in China? So of course, you have to be fluent in Mandarin to business standard. Being able to chit-chat in a bar doesn't count, as far as I'm concerned. You have to be able to negotiate, for example, in Mandarin, to be able to operate effectively. Again, I have been lucky because I was kind of born in a generation where people would still put up with our sort of slightly Hong Kong accented Mandarin when operating in China. But these days, the Chinese clients' tolerance of your heavily accented Mandarin is not very high actually. So they would expect you to be completely fluent in the language, because the reality is, you have a lot of competitors from China. A lot of students from China actually studied abroad. The English is no worse than yours, and the Chinese is definitely better than yours, because that's their mother tongue. Let's be real about it. So you should set yourself a very high standard when it comes to language skills. And the ability to read Chinese is obviously very important. A lot of the transactions we do, we have to read Chinese. A lot of the due diligence work that you do as a junior lawyer involves reading Chinese. Being able to write, I know a lot of you will probably, I actually really liked a letter in Chinese or draft a document in Chinese. I said, more than 50% of you probably can't do that. That's okay. It's good to be able to draft in Chinese. It's a major advantage, I would say. But in our business, at least if you're working in an international law firm, being able to speak and read is more important than being able to draft to high standards. But if you have the Chinese drafting skills, don't lose it. It's extremely valuable. And the other thing about doing business in China is that having a deep understanding of the business and people's culture in China is actually key. And you may think that you're all Chinese, so you know the Chinese culture. Let me assure you that I've been operating in China for the past 28 years. Even I cannot admit that I completely understand the Chinese, the mainland Chinese business and people's cultures. Sometimes, I have a good understanding, but again, this is where your competitors from the mainland have a major advantage over you. And so, because they were born and bred in China, they have a much better understanding as to how this person connects with the other guy and so on. And they're extremely good at that as well. Something I've actually learned over the years. But don't despair. I may have slightly dented your confidence. But we, with our sort of training, with our upbringing in Hong Kong, do have certain advantage over our counterparts. For example, we live in a world where information flows freely. So we have been able to access a lot of information a lot easier than our mainland counterparts. I like to think that we have a broader kind of international or at least regional perspective. I hope you do. And so this is actually your edge. And the good thing is that now this market is actually very big and offers a lot of opportunities, and which can accommodate different people with different skill sets. So whilst your mainland counterparts have a lot to bring to the table, you can also bring a lot of value to a firm like us. And above all, we expect everyone. I don't care where they are from, and I expect all of us to be good lawyers. And by being a good lawyer, you will always have a competitive edge. When I say good lawyer, I don't necessarily mean just a good lawyer in a pure technical sense. I'm talking about the whole package. Your client management skills, your negotiation skills, your people skills, and so on. Because we deal with people every day. So, some final thoughts. I've meant to talk for about 30 minutes. I've probably exceeded that already. and I'll try to sort of leave some time for questions. I'm sure a lot of you will be thinking about this issue. I've been asked this question many times. Will Shanghai surpass Hong Kong as a financial center, and hence, potentially as a legal services center? We in Hong Kong are really very lucky. A lot of international law firms use Hong Kong as a regional hub, and we do a lot of regional work from Hong Kong. Will Shanghai replace us in 10, 20 years' time? I wish I had the answer, but if I were a betting man, my answer to that is unlikely in the next 10, 20 years. Beyond that, I don't know. And so in your, certainly, well, it certainly won't happen during my legal career, but it may happen during yours. So, the point here is, we can't afford to be complacent. Hong Kong has got to develop. And the second point I want to talk about is the future liberalization of the PRC legal services market. I believe when I say future liberalization, I'm more talking about, I've explained that China probably sits right in the middle of the spectrum. I expect it to become a little bit more liberal by allowing international law firms to do a bit more in the future. So for example, a merger with a Chinese law firm could be a possibility in the next 10, 15 years. I don't know when, but I believe it is inevitable. Again, it may or may not happen during my legal career, but I'm very confident that it will happen during yours. And what does that mean for us? I think it will have a huge implication for someone like us, because once that happens, then particularly if foreign law firms are allowed to practice PRC law by hiring Chinese lawyers or by merging with a Chinese law firm or doing a joint venture with a Chinese law firm, then it changes the competitive landscape completely. And it also opens up more possibilities for someone like you who's still pondering over your career choice. So watch this space. I think this is a very interesting development that we need to watch very carefully. The recent merger of King & Wood, the largest law firm, and in my days, there were only 5 Hong Kong Chinese. In my batch, only 5 Hong Kong Chinese working as article class, as we would then call it, in international law firms. Only 5. And we were almost regarded as a bit of a kind of, a bit of a kind of, I wouldn't say silly, but it was a bit of an outlier. We weren't in the mainstream, so to speak, because very few of my peers did that. And but I'm sure those 5 of us who actually chose to do that had a certain vision, had a certain dream. Again, I didn't know whether that dream was going to work out or not in my days. Well, with hindsight, thankfully it did. But that's not the point, though. And the point here is be a bit more adventurous. After all, you're already young, right? And explore. Try to sort of go down, try to trot try to track down trodden path, and try to grow. So on that note, I'll pause and ask you to ask a few questions.
Thank you. I was just going to ask, you talked a lot about competition. What does it mean for an international law firm? Chinese companies are selecting legal providers based upon pricing primarily. And do you see this changing in the future?
Not going to change anytime soon. Competition is going to increase rather than decrease over time because we see more. People like, for example, King & Wood. They used to be the biggest local law firm in the PRC. before the merger, they didn't actually compete with us on some of the outbound, transactions. But now they do. They have the capability, they have the people to compete with us. So, I don't see pricing, getting any better in the short term. It may get a little bit better once the Chinese clients become a little bit more sophisticated, but that's a steep learning curve for them. And, in my reckoning, it will take, at least 10 years before they actually get up that learning curve. So what does that mean for us? It simply means that we have to work a little bit more smartly and have the right. My strategy is actually very simple. I want to have a highly efficient team who's actually able to handle this type of work and this type of clients, which means that they need to be bilingual, they need to be highly trained. And a lot of firms, when they actually do outbound transaction acting for Chinese clients, they would have, because the expertise actually lies in people who do not have the language skills. For example, in the oil and gas sector, very few Chinese lawyers actually have this kind of expertise. So all the expertise lies in the non-Chinese speaking lawyers. And then so we have to mix and match the team with people who can actually speak the language and people with the right sort of expertise. Of course, inevitably there will be duplication. So the aim is to try to, to train up our Chinese-speaking lawyers to be able to work on, the oil and gas transactions, mining transactions, whatever transactions that you're looking at, and try to operate a little bit more efficiently. And then another thing, again, this goes to the so-called 1C. 1C does help in this regard, in the sense that very often, we gave a fee cap, a fee quote on a capped basis, with certain assumptions and scope of work, of course. But as always, the assumptions, went out of the window, and we tried to renegotiate. And because of their rather rigid procurement process, the scope for renegotiation, has been very limited. But again, this is where, if you have the right sort of relationship, they might be prepared to help you to, again, go through their kind of internal system to help you to revise your fee quote.
Any more questions?
Thank you. As a partner in an international law firm, would you consider it to be an alternative or even an excellent alternative for these law firms to acquire more PLC qualified lawyers in the firm rather than waiting for potential merger with a local firm or even waiting for the liberalization of the PLC legal services market, which we may not know when will happen?
Yeah, I can't speak for other firms, but I can speak for mine. Again, it depends on what sort of practice that you're looking at. Broadly, we divide our practice into outbound, inbound. For the inbound practice, you do actually need PLC qualified lawyers with knowledge of PLC laws and regulations. For the outbound work, typically not. And so, we need both. And we have been hiring in the past, 25 years, Chinese lawyers with Chinese qualification, with Chinese law experience in doing typically the inbound work. And but for the outbound work, we have been using more international lawyers. And at the end of the day, we need a mix of both. And so we wouldn't stop hiring PLC qualified lawyers. The only downside for them is that once they join us, they have to give up their practicing certificates and so on. But a lot of people are still prepared to do that because they still see us as a better training ground in overall terms compared with some local firms. So if you don't have any questions, let me perhaps just take this opportunity to wish you all a Merry Christmas and a long and satisfying career. Thank you.
very inspiring section. I think we're all thinking about how to position ourselves better in the future. And I just invite Noble to present you our solution. Thank you very much, Mr. I think we can now take a very short 5-minute break, go to stretch your legs, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. Thank you.